Good evening, and thank you so much for coming to this Think-In. It's a really lovely day outside, so extra thank yous for joining and coming to be with us on Zoom. I'm Ella Hill, I'm a reporter at Tortoise, and I'll be hosting this Think-In today along with my colleague Phoebe Davis, who is looking after you in the chat. And we've got a few invited experts this evening who are really embedded in the policy side of things and who know a lot in a lot of detail about what's going on in universities with regard to sexual violence and with regard to how universities handle student complaints, what the process is, what it looks like. So we're going to hear from them soon. But what we really want to try to do in Think-Ins is to hear from you in the audience as well. And we've got some students and some student activists here today, and we'd really like to hear from you about your point of view on the culture on uni campuses, on the way that consent is spoken about and taught, and on the way that sexual violence is addressed at your university. So if you've got a story or a perspective that you think it would be valuable to share, please do. That's what the forum is for, but do be mindful that it's a public discussion, so please be careful about naming individuals and things like that. And just to say, usually we ask people contributing to Think-Ins to give their full name and to come on camera, but this is a sensitive one. So if you prefer to speak anonymously, that's completely okay. And if you've got a story to share, but you prefer to speak in private, you can do that too. And Phoebe, if you could, you can put my email address down in the chat and you can talk to me that way. And before we come to some of our experts, I just like to situate this discussion and where I'm coming from on it. So me and my colleague Chris Cook, who's here this evening as well, did some reporting on campus safety and campus justice last year, where we looked in depth at the mishandling of sexual assault allegations at Trinity Hall, which is a college in Cambridge. And I also did a piece of research where I looked at sexual misconduct policies and the university rules for the UK's 60 largest universities. And you will have seen from the slides at the beginning, Phoebe's slides, that some of our findings from that. So we looked at things like time limits to complain and whether universities had specific policies. So this is a piece of reporting that's ongoing, and it's a really big priority for us at Tortoise. And I think it's obviously a really important and timely one too, because apart from, you know, the occasional article in the papers or new reports and new consultations coming out, it can be an issue that unfortunately disappears from people's rearview mirrors a bit. But with Everyone's Invited, we've reached a point where this has really come back into view. You know, there are more than 100 universities that have been named there, and today as well, the Office for Students published a new statement of expectations for preventing and addressing harassment and sexual misconduct. And we've got Nicola Dandridge, the Chief Executive of the Office for Students, here to talk about that. But before we come to Nicola, I'd really like to start off by talking to Danny Bradford. And Danny is a researcher and an activist who works on sexual violence in higher education. And Danny, I'd like you, if you can, to give us a bit of context to the question we're asking today, which is, are women safe on campus? So as an activist and a researcher in this space, what's your perspective on that? What's the situation with universities at the moment? Do we have a good idea, good information about the scale of the problem?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, first of all. It's wonderful to be here. The question, are women safe on campus? I mean, first of all, you know, it's not the case that every single woman that goes to campus is going to have a negative experience necessarily, but we know that too many women do. So the Office for National Statistics released a new report recently, which showed that full-time undergraduate female students were at the highest risk of experiencing sexual violence than any other occupation. So women are at huge risk on campus. And I think we also have to think about, what kinds of women are at the most risk as well. So, statistically, we know that trans women, sex worker students, LGBT and disabled women on campus are disproportionately affected. And I think that that's really important to keep in mind when we have these conversations, because I really do feel like those conversations can get lost, or those voices can get lost in these conversations we have. So, I mean, in the short of it, I think no, not enough women are safe on campus. And I think that there are particular groups of students as well that are particularly vulnerable and that aren't being protected adequately by their universities.
Okay. Thank you, Danny, for that sort of. It's a really good to have that as an introduction. Anna, Dr. Anna Bull, is from an organisation called the 1752 Group. She is also an academic and a researcher who works on sexual violence in higher education, and from your work at the 1752 Group, Anna, I know that we're talking mainly about students here today, but in your work you've looked at staff student sexual misconduct and harassment as well. So how would you describe the scale of the problem at universities?
So, we're really if it's necessarily getting worse at this stage, but we do know, yes, as Danny said, there's more than 1 in 10 female undergraduate students will experience sexual violence in a year while they're studying. So this is a really big ask for universities to address this. And actually, universities have never really confronted the scale of the problem. And I actually think even now they're not fully confronting the scale of the problem, because here we are 5 years on from a really high profile report from Universities UK, which is a kind of sector-wide lobby group. And that report in 2016, 100 and something pages, laid out what universities should be doing to address the issue. And 5 years on, we're finding some institutions are making some really good progress, but it's very, very patchy across the sector. And it really shouldn't make a difference what university you're at if you're going to get appropriately supported if you experience sexual violence or harassment. And if the person who harassed you or assaulted you is held accountable for their actions, that shouldn't depend on which institution you go to. We need much, much better standards across the sector. And it's a big ask, but this issue is not going to go away.
And why is it, if we're just not collecting data on this, why is it that we don't know about the scale of this issue?
Well, yeah, it's partly that we don't have very good quality data other than the Office for National Statistics. So in Australia, in the US, they have done major large-scale surveys to find out what is going on. I've just been doing one here at my own university, but across the UK, nobody's actually gathering that data to find, other than kind of individual academics trying to make this happen. So it's really hard. If you want to address a problem, you do have to kind of measure the problem. You have to measure the baseline and then measure and try and make interventions and make change. And we haven't even got to that point of actually kind of measuring the issue. And I know that there is discussions going on around this. But there's also, there's a lot more specificity needed in terms of how we need to address this issue.
Yeah, and another thing that I'd like to ask you, Anna, is as I said, we are focusing principally on students this evening, but I'd like to know a bit more about the work that you do in terms of staff incidents of sexual misconduct and staff incidents. Could you speak a bit about how big that problem is as well? Have we still got Anna? Oh, I think yes.
Sorry, you just froze a bit there, but I think I got you. Yeah, so we've focused on staff, usually academic staff, but any university staff who have perpetrated sexual violence and misconduct towards students. And universities, there's so much potential for staff to do harm towards students because they are in a position of trust. But actually, the vast majority of universities in this country don't have any clear boundaries for staff to student sexual romantic relationships. There can be really blurred boundaries, and those blurred boundaries can be taken advantage of by staff who are in positions of power. And it's actually, and universities have been very slow to address this issue. And, we're still seeing issues of what you might call pass the perpetrator. I've just heard today from some students who are concerned that a lecturer who's targeted them has moved on to get another job at a different institution, seemingly with impunity. So these kinds of issues are still going on. And also it's really hard to tell. There's so much secrecy around this issue. There's a lack of transparency. We need much more transparency around the data that universities are reporting on nationally, in order to be able to see if we're actually making progress on this issue, because we don't really know. Most universities actually don't really publish the number of complaints, how many complaints are upheld. Of course, we can't publish the individual details, but we need to know how universities are doing, and we need to know if they're actually taking action on this issue. I know that some are, but I also know that some are not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that it might be useful at this point to come to my colleague Phoebe Davis, who has the slides which we saw at the top, and just to sort of, in addition to what Anna and Danny have said, to walk us through what the problem looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to kind of start off, I've dropped a link into the chat. You can go to the page where Ella and Chris's work was from last year, specifically at Trinity Hall and at Cambridge, and following multiple stories and as it kind of unraveled and the way that they treated students who'd reported sexual misconduct and also actions of teachers. And so I feel like this testimony from Woman A, who was one of the women who was in the in the report, was a really good way of kind of starting the discussion. It's the lack of safeguarding, the lack of interest in protecting its students, and just to also say the importance of this kind of reporting. It led to the master then leaving his position at the head of Trinity Hall. It's really important that we continue to put the time and the effort into doing this kind of reporting. And if we go to the next slide. So is it safe on campus? It is really hard to do this from surveys alone, and we always do take that with a pinch of salt, but this one from the NUS in kind of 2018 into 2019 kind of gives a good snapshot for us. 75% of respondents had an unwanted sexual experience at least once. 14% had experienced attempted rape or unwanted sexual intercourse, and 14% of those who had experience of that didn't go on to report it. And I think that's the really important thing there. If they don't have the ability to go forward and report on sexual misconduct, that can be incredibly dangerous. And also this report found that 15% had considered suicide of those that had reported feeling that reported sexual misconduct or sexual harassment, and 13% self-harm, and some had even attempted suicide. This is a really severe issue. This puts people's lives at risk. And yeah, just to give a little bit of background and context to the situation at the moment. So this is a little bit of work that Ella did last year for their report. So this is kind of looking at time limits on students making allegations against staff, and we'll come on to the OFS recommendations in a minute, and there is some specific things there on time limits. Those time limits are incredibly important. The fact that there was not specified time limits for 15 of the universities, and this is specifically for reporting students making allegations against staff, or a limit of 3 months. So that time limit is incredibly important, and it does make a massive difference to the case. And I will drop a link again to Ella's full piece so you can read and kind of give the full context of that stat, because it's incredibly important that we again look into that. And it's also important to say the 752 group their research found that 41% had experienced at least one instance of sexualized behavior from staff in a survey they did. So this is it's an issue that I necessarily wasn't aware of when I was at university, but is larger than you may think as well. And then coming on to the Office for Students. So today they published their expectations from their consultation. It was a consultation that was started way back before the pandemic and got delayed because of that, has now completely come out. And this is a great quote from Nicola that kind of paints a picture. So despite some improvements, there's been a lack of progress. There isn't effective systems and policies and procedures across the sector. And that's one of the issues that we found, was that there is a kind of a cut and paste approach to some of the legislation, and there isn't specific and very effective measures for reporting, for communication, and for dealing with sexual misconduct. And as a result, students continue to have real problems. So I'll drop the link again to the OFS recommendations. It's worth a read. It's also worth saying that they are recommendations, not regulation, which I'm sure that Ella will come on to. But this is some of them include training being made available on an ongoing basis for all staff and students to raise awareness, fair and clear and accessible approach to taking action. So that's having clear disclosure, clear reports, effective support for students involved in the process. And that, I would say, includes both students who have accused and those who have been accused, and clear communication across the whole organisation about what is going on, which is a consistent issue. So that's, like, again, a very brief snapshot. I will drop more links into the chat because I understand that a snapshot doesn't always show the full picture, but that hopefully will help.
Thank you so much, Phoebe. And we've had a look there at some of the kind of key points from the Office for Student Statement of Expectations that was published today. And I'd like to come to Nicola Dandridge to talk to her about that. So Nicola is the Chief Executive of the Office for Students, and I'd like to ask you about, you know, what this new statement of expectations lays out, what the sort of intention of it was from the Office for Students as well, and what you hope it will achieve for the sector.
Thanks, Ella, and thank you so much, not only for inviting me and the OFS to this event, but also for laying on this event on such an important subject. It's really great to have this conversation now. So as Anna described, actually, what we see at the Office for Students are some universities and colleges dealing with complaints well, but it is inconsistent, and many are failing and letting students, particularly female students, down to a really worrying extent. And so as the Office for Students, the regulator for students, I should say we cover England only, English universities and colleges only. What we've done is publish it's a statement of expectations, actually, rather than recommendations. This is what we as the regulator expect for universities and colleges, and it's designed to set a common, consistent set of standards, in part to try and prevent this from happening in the first place, and I'll come on to how we hope it will do that, but also to ensure that universities and colleges deal properly when complaints are made. And the first part is how do we hope this will stop harassment and sexual misconduct from happening in the first place? Well, what it sets out really clearly is a set of behavioural expectations for all staff, students and visitors, which makes clear what the university and colleges think is acceptable conduct and what is not, and also the sanctions that they might impose for breaches. So you've got right up front a sense of this is what the university thinks is acceptable and this is what is not. And then one of the expectations relates to training for staff. So you've got that common understanding across the whole institution, and clear accountability and governance, and that picks up the question of monitoring what's happening within the college. And we say that governing bodies need to know what is happening in the college. and university. Then on the other side of it, it's making sure that there are in place clear and easily accessible processes for students to report complaints when incidents do happen. I mean, I have to say, from my perspective, I've found this the most worrying aspect of all of this, that students simply don't know what to do, so they don't complain as you flagged up in your opening statistics. This simply should not be happening, and there must be clear, accessible processes so every student knows what to do and where to go if something does happen to them. And we also say that the procedures need to be in place to enable the university and college to investigate complaints fairly and independently and swiftly, and then that support is made available for students, including specialist help and medical advice when required. I mean, it's several pages long, I should say, but that's the nub of it. And what we're saying here is that we expect universities to get their organisations in order, in line with these expectations. And then, I mean, just to finish, what we're proposing to do is look over the course of the next year, or the next few months anyway, what changes are made, how they respond to these expectations, and what difference it makes. And as part of that, we will be looking at whether or not we should explicitly link these expectations to our regulatory requirements.
Right. So that was the question that I was going to ask you, was, will there be, at some point in the future, do you imagine that there will be penalties for universities? You know, will there be a clear framework, first of all, for the expectations to be, you know, this is what you have to do, and will there be, you know, punishment for universities that aren't living up to those expectations?
2 points on that, Ella. I mean, absolutely. This is what we're looking at, is whether or not, if universities and colleges do not respond, and there's not a tangible difference to the students' experience, then that's the course we'll have to go down, and that would involve sanctions and fines and so on. So we do have the regulatory teeth, if you like. But we do have some powers now. At the moment, one of our regulatory conditions, one of our registration conditions, is that all universities and colleges should have effective management and governance arrangements. And so in some circumstances, if the situation now suggests that a university hasn't got effective management, then we can intervene, and we do and have. But it's not specifically tied to harassment and misconduct. That's the point, and that's what these expectations do.
We had someone in the chat who has a really good question for you, Nicola. So Chelsea Mayer, if you're around, would you like to put your question to Nicola yourself?
Yeah, that's fine. I'm happy to. I think I've just managed to unmute myself. Yeah. Hi, Nicola. Yeah, I just wanted to ask, so it's been 16 months, I think, since the proposed expectations were published, and they don't seem too different to the final ones. I was just wondering if you've seen enough tangible change in that last 16 months that gives you confidence that universities will take the next year to act, or do you envisage it going to regulations and sanctions?
Chelsea, that's such a good question. So we published a consultation, and that consultation process informed these expectations, but then the whole thing got completely waylaid by coronavirus. It's just been such an odd 12 months. I don't think we can draw many conclusions from what's happened with face-to-face teaching suspended. I can't comment, and I don't know. Do I think it's going to make a difference? I think, well, I hope so. It should. I find it astonishing that these things are not taken more seriously. So it should. And I think what we're doing here is just setting out so clearly what it is we expect. So I think my response to your question is, I think it should make a difference. Of course, if it doesn't, then we will need to regulate.
Thank you, Nicola. I'd like to, if I can, to come to Anna, who has her hand up, and just ask you, Anna, what were your expectations of what the OFS statement would look like, and did it meet your expectations, and if not, what would you like to see?
Well, first of all, I'm glad the OFS are taking some action in this area. I know that universities are already paying attention to it, but as you know, it's the usual suspects, the ones who are already kind of thinking about these issues. I do think that the statement of expectations is very high level, it's very general, despite the fact that we're 5 years on from the Changing the Culture report. And there's a lot of issues that the sector really needs leadership on from the Office for Students or other organisations. There's a lot of difficulties that are coming up. If we say, run a fair investigation, fair and independent investigation, that's a very, very complicated thing that universities are struggling with. And I think one of the main things I'm concerned about is the assumption that if we follow the processes that are in place at the moment, the complaints and investigation processes that are in place at universities at the moment, even those universities who are revising those, I don't think complainants and survivors are going to get what they need from their universities. So from my research, I've found that the reason students make complaints of sexual harassment against staff is to protect themselves and to protect others, to protect other women and other students, often queer students who are also targeted, to protect themselves and to protect others from being targeted by the same member of staff, the same perpetrator. What we see an individualized complaints process where people have to make an individual complaint against an individual member of staff, which doesn't recognize that sexual harassment and sexual violence are systemic. Sexual harassment, it is, by definition, it's discrimination on the basis of membership of a group, that group being women in this case. And we know that particularly for staff sexual misconduct, usually staff are targeting multiple other students and staff. And so the assumption that the complaints processes we have are actually just going to work, and the survivors are going to get the justice that they want. I mean, I think the Warwick example, the Warwick protesters, and I take my hat off to you guys. What Warwick has been through over the last year, and what students at Warwick, I should say, have been through over the last couple of years, has shown that that even if you're following roughly the processes that you want to, even if you're not getting it quite right, but getting it roughly right, it's not going to meet the justice needs of survivors. So that's one of my main concerns.
Thank you, Anna. Nicola, would you like to respond to those points that Anna was making?
I think that, yes, I would, because I think they're very good points. And I sort of broadly agree with what Anna's just said. I think the challenge is that it's not necessarily that helpful to be, in our experience, to be really specific about process, because rather, as you said, people can tick the box and miss the point. And I think we, as a regulator, find that generally it's more helpful to be clear about what your objectives are, because then it's actually much more robust as a regulatory mechanism, rather than saying, can you do this, that, and the other. Having said that, I take your point about process. I think process is incredibly important in cases of sexual misconduct and harassment. And what we've got to balance here is the fact that we are regulating a massive variety of universities and colleges, from huge multi-faculty campuses based in towns with 30,000-40,000 students, and then very small providers with just a couple of hundred people and not many staff. So I think the difficulty about being prescriptive about processes is that what might work for one won't work for the other. So I think your point is good, though, and I totally accept that there is a risk that people will not do this, and I think that's what we're going to be looking at over the next few months. But I worry that being prescriptive isn't necessarily the solution. There's got to be culture change. I mean, that's what really is going to change things here. And it's actually having these events and Tortoise Media promoting this sort of issue and us all shouting about this quite loudly and prominently. I mean, this is how I think things will change. And I hope our statement of expectations will legitimize those sorts of discussions to secure that culture change?
Thank you, Nicola. I'd really like to come to a few of the students that we have on the call shortly. I know that we've got some representatives from the Protect Warwick Women campaign here, and it'd be great to hear from you. And I've seen a few other people in the chat talking about their experiences from their universities as well. But before I do that, I'd also like to come back to Danny and to ask her about, you know, what she thinks this new statement of expectations means, and whether you think it goes far enough.
Yeah, it's a good question. Thank you. I do take the point about not being too prescriptive. Yeah, I mean, I spent a long time kind of going through the statement earlier, and a few things kind of came to mind immediately, which is kind of on a similar vein to Anna about detail. You know, I am concerned. Well, first of all, I'd like to say I think it's wonderful that this has been published, and I am especially hopeful about the conversations about potential sanctions if universities don't start taking this seriously. But things that concern me is I think in regulations where there's phrases such as when possible or when appropriate, it's very easy for universities to say, well, in that case it wasn't appropriate, or in that case it wasn't possible because our lawyers told us that it would break GDPR, or, you know, etc. So when you have these kind of it's very easy for universities to kind of brush off individual cases when there's such flexibility in the kind of recommendations. And my second concern is that I think that where universities really need guidance are the cases that don't fit neatly into these kind of campus-based sexual violence situations. So they're instances that happen on their year abroad. They're instances where, you know, it's two students but from different universities. Instances where it's on academic fieldwork. I mean, that's where I do my research is academic fieldwork. Where universities go, we don't even know if we have jurisdiction here. You know, can we even investigate this because this is involving someone from another university, or is this happened abroad? So does that come under our rules? And so these kind of like really tough cases that are so easy to fall through the cracks, I worry aren't being addressed and aren't being spoken about enough. So that those would be my kind of two main concerns. But I'm very pleased to hear about the potential possibility of sanctions if we don't see some concrete changes within the next year.
Thanks, Danny. I think that you highlight a really important point there about universities not having sort of, unless things are very, very clearly laid out, it's difficult to sort of probably get them to do what they need to do. But I'd like to come now to Kai from the Warwick University Protect Warwick Women campaign, if I could. And
yeah, first I just want to apologise for any like noises. I'm still currently outside of the protest site, and I want to thank you for inviting us. Yeah, so we are on our 32nd day at the moment. So we've been out here for a while, and the communication with the uni has been subpar at best. We found they've been lying about a lot of stuff. They go behind our backs about certain things. So we've been pushing for them to be really transparent about everything that's going on, because we want to be transparent too. And we asked for them to make a statement to where they've agreed to us. We have a whole list of demands. It's on our Instagram. I won't go through them now because there's quite a few. But we asked them to put out a statement to the public and to send it out to students for them to agree to the demands so they can't go back on it. So they sent us a statement first, and they used the wording, we agree to these demands. And then when the statement was released, it changed to we support these demands. And that's like not the first thing they've done. That's a little bit sly and underhand. But yeah, I just want to go back to a previous point about culture change. And yeah, we've noticed here that the change in culture is like what's really going to push things forward, because no matter how the university reacts, what the university does, they're never going to be able to change people's behaviors. And we found that here we've created a new culture on the university campus, and we've had many men come forward and say, you're educating us, we're educating our friends. So that's really what's pushing it forward. But university change is just like a bonus. Yeah, I'm not sure what else you want me to talk about.
Yeah, so I was going to ask you about that culture question actually, and I was what I sort of want to know is, do you think universities can do themselves? So, you know, you as students are doing things to address that culture, but what do you think universities should be doing apart from, you know, a consent workshop during Freshers Week, or do you think that they really-
So we think mandatory education is very, very important, and more outreach to the students. We do also think that sufficient punishment will help, because what we found at Warwick is they have this zero tolerance policy, but they have allowed assaulters back on campus, particularly with the rape group chat, which was very well publicised. People are very aware of the fact that these men were allowed back on campus, back in the same vicinity of the women they joked about raping. And it creates this idea for perpetrators that their behaviours are going to be accepted, they're going to be tolerated, they're not going to be punished as they should be. So yeah, sufficient punishment, and also not just like outreach to the students, but also community outreach. And we think because Warwick is a Russell group, if they start making the change that we're asking them to implement, it will set a trend for other universities. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so universities need to take action and lead by example then. Okay. I'd like to, if I can, to come to Alessandra Peters. I think you've got your hand up, Alessandra, and you made a point earlier in the chat, I think. Can you run me through what your point was and what you'd like to raise?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's pretty similar to Kai's point, is that, you know, when people aren't seeing the response from the university, when they're seeing the people around them, their friends, the people on their courses report and go through this intensely traumatic process, oftentimes, when they're seeing that end in no consequence, when they're seeing no safeguarding measures put in place, when they're seeing no tangible consequences, that is incredibly off-putting. And I think that's a big factor towards these sort of low reporting rates that we see in universities, in addition to obviously the barriers that already exist for people coming forwards about sexual violence. And I also wanted to raise a different point. I was wondering if maybe Nicola could elaborate on this, about, you know, we've spoken about how important it is that these discussions are being held, that this is becoming a bigger story, that we're all here talking about it. And I agree, it's vital, and I'm really grateful for everyone here for being part of this discussion. But my concern really, as a student who is campaigning on campus and who wants to speak out, and you know, who's had experience with this, when students are being threatened with confidentiality clauses, non-disclosure agreements, and threats of expulsion and disciplinary action for literally making a comment, for literally posting something on their Twitter, for retweeting something, you know, how can students be supported in making that change? How can people with the lived experience offer their contributions? How can universities make sure that they're seeking the opinions of these students when it's terrifying to even speak anywhere near this subject for risk of action? So yeah, I'd just like to ask that. Thank you.
Thanks, Alessandra. Nicola, how do you think that students can be better involved and consulted on discussions like this? Because as we've heard from Kai and as we've heard from Alessandra, a lot of students have a point of view about what they think should happen, and we've seen also from you know, everyone's invited, that's a big focus of what's happening, is that people who have experiences of sexual misconduct, sexual violence, sexual harassment on campus, and then the complaints process, they do have ideas. So how can we better involve them?
Well, the statement of expectations does actually say that universities and colleges should involve students and student unions. So that's written into it. So I think at that sort of collective level, we would expect the implementation of policies and practices to involve students and student unions. If it wasn't, there's something going wrong there. So I regardless of the individual case, I hope that at that collective level that will happen, and certainly we're signalling we think it should. I think for individual students who are not able to take their claims forward, I mean, that is just such an obvious breach of what should be happening, B, what we're saying in the statement, where universities should be looking at ways of removing barriers to reporting, not imposing them. So I think that's the sort of situation which really would run up against what our expectations are. We're, as the regulator, we're not able to help individual students. It's beyond our powers. But there are, of course, other bodies who can, and complaints can be made. I know that's not quite the point, but we can receive notifications from students. And I think if there is, widespread problems about the way universities are approaching this, then students and student unions should let us know. And we can look at it at that sort of general level that I described before. The point about non-disclosure agreements as well, I mean, transparency is a really important principle, and that's in the statement of expectations too. So, I mean, I don't want to be piling it all into the statement of expectations and say that's going to sort everything, because it's unlikely in itself. But perhaps I could just say one further thing, actually, Ella. I mean, it's not as if at the Office for Students we've published this thing and then we're just going to be sitting back and saying get on with this. We're going to be looking very closely at what happens. We're going to be monitoring it, and I think maybe most usefully from your point of view, we're going to be working with bodies within the sector, representative bodies, to work up case studies and look at processes that have worked and are successful. So I think the point about notifications and why it's so helpful to hear your experience is that if there's an issue about students not being allowed to pursue complaints, what we can do is, for the moment, we can build that into some case studies saying, look, this is how a university A has dealt with this problem and dealt with it properly, and then we'll promote that and push it out as an example of good practice. So if you, Alexandra, then find yourself in a situation where that's not happening in your university, we'll make these resources available, so you can say, look, this is what the regulator expects. This is an example of where another university has done it. So I think whilst we're monitoring what happens, we're also going to be pushing out those sorts of examples of practice that will deal with process and touch on some of the things that you've just identified.
Thank you, Nicola. I think that Danny Bradford has her hand up and wanted to respond to one of the points. We spoke earlier, Danny, about how if you don't understand, if you're not collecting data, you don't understand the scale of the problem, and it's hard to deal with a problem that you don't understand the size of. Could you talk a bit about that, but also respond to one of the points I think that Alessandra made about how actually difficult the process of reporting is for many students as well?
Yeah, definitely. So on the kind of first point about the data, I mean, Anna raised it earlier, we don't have very good quality data at the moment. I was slightly saddened that the statement of expectations didn't include mandatory disclosure of number of cases, the result of cases, sanctions put in place to be publicly available, because I think that would be a really important step for universities. I find speaking to universities, advising them on how they can tackle these issues, a lot of the fear is about reputational damage, but if that information is already being made public, then I think it takes away some of that fear that universities have, where they don't want to say find someone guilty of or uphold a complaint because of the potential of reputational damage. And then I just really want to say about Alessandra's point, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, I've been working on sexual violence in higher education for 5 years now, and I've spoken to hundreds of students, and it got to the point in the last kind of year and a half where students often come to me and ask for help with reporting, which I always give. I'm happy to be a mediator, help them compose emails and speak to their universities, etc. But it got to a point about a year and a half ago where when students come to me and say, should I report? I couldn't in good conscience say, yes, you should, because the procedures do not serve students. They don't serve victims of sexual violence. So I always say to students, that has to be your choice. I reported and I wouldn't go back and not report, but was it the right decision? Will it be the right decision for you? It is incredibly difficult. It's incredibly re-traumatizing for victims as well. And I think there's been a huge betrayal from institutions to students to survivors. And if it's great to try and encourage students to report and to try and change these processes, but without that kind of rebuilding of trust, without universities actually coming forwards and saying, we haven't done what we should, we haven't protected our students, at times we've actively re-traumatized them, we're working to change. Without that rebuilding of trust, I don't see students using these processes at the level that they should be. So that really concerns me. I think it's a really important point to consider about how many people don't report, and actually, is it the right thing to encourage them to report? Not always. It's really not.
Thank you very much, Danny. I think that it's important to sort of understand how difficult it can be to actually even bring a report forward, and until that process is easier and better and works for students and universities, I don't think this is a problem that's going to be resolved. I'd like to speak to Gemma McCall from Culture Shift about this, and you've been making some points in the chat, Gemma, about how can we move forward. What are some of the looking forwards to a solution? What can we do?
I think there's a few things that that we need to, first of all, kind of move the conversation on from. I feel like we've been at this point for quite a few years. There's, we were told about prevalence by the Hidden Marks campaign back in 2010. Then in 2016, the UK published its guidance. We know that there's a problem and change isn't happening quick enough, in my opinion, and cohorts of students are being really let down and traumatized needlessly. Institutions need to know that like acknowledge that there is a problem publicly, stop worrying about their reputations, because their reputations are going to keep being dragged through the mud when one-off cases kind of happen every so often. There is a problem. It is a problem across higher education, across the world, but in the UK. So stop kind of hiding the fact that there is potentially a problem and questioning whether there is. Publish your reporting figures. There are only a handful of universities, to my knowledge, that are doing this, but having that public this is the problem. This is what we've done about it. This is what was reported anonymously. This is what was reported named. These are the issues. This is why people reported anonymously. And this is why we as an institution, this is how we are going to help you trust us more and earn that trust back, and encourage you to make a named report so that we can handle these issues properly. I think I've been talking in the chat about GDPR constantly being used as a reason not to share information, and that needs to be nipped in the bud as soon as possible, because that can't keep being an excuse for institutions not to be sharing things. And constant, persistent and consistent campaigns about what the university is doing about to tackle these issues, and to help educate. There's been some really good chat in the there's been really good discussion in the chat about what as a man can I do to help educate my friends about what is and isn't acceptable. Universities should be definitely communicating that and using the opportunity to their voice to do so. There's loads that we can do. We've got to move this conversation on from, is there a problem at our institution or not?
That's really good to sort of get towards a bit more of that discussion about how we can come towards really digging into making sure that we can make sure that universities have a culture that is inclusive and that appreciates the experience of survivors, and that really teaches students about the expectations for their behaviour. And with that in mind, I'd like to come to Peter, who was talking in the chat, I think, about from his perspective as a male student, and his understanding of the effects of people's behaviour. Hi, Peter.
Hi there. Yeah, go on, sorry.
No, you go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, so I'm just a third year student, and we have a compulsory module at the beginning of the year. But really, other than that, there's not really much talk which I kind of feel within the student body about it. And some of my friends have been affected by it, and especially with the Guardian report that came out the other day, with those statistics. I think it's really an issue which I feel on these chats like these, I feel it's only females that are on them, and that they're really, especially in the male community, there's just a lack of conversation, really.
Mm-hmm. And do you have any ideas for how your university or other universities could change that, could make that better? What's been your experience of education around this point?
So I'm open for education, really. I'm not too sure. Mm-hmm. I would really like to hear what other people have to say about it, really.
Okay, that's good to hear. Could we bring in Kai on that point, about education and about what your campaign would like to see, if you're available?
Yeah, so like I said in the chat, we found that pushing the narrative that it's also a men's issue has really helped. But unfortunately, as I said in the chat, men only really tend to listen to men. So we do have a couple guys on our team who have had instances where they've had to remove people from the piazza who have been known sexual assaulters, because they won't listen to the women at the piazza. Yeah, we also just want to, we're just really pushing for everybody to discuss it. But yeah, we've seen a lot of traction from different guys, which is really great. Yeah, I don't know, it's a bit of a tricky one, because we've also found that the people who are really who will come to the events are people who are already researching stuff like this, and are already invested in fighting sexual assault. So we're trying to find ways to outreach to communities and people that aren't already talking about things like this, which has been difficult so far. But we've definitely made some headway because we have quite a big following already, and it's more of a domino effect. So we're trying to outreach as many different types of people as we can, and then hopefully they pass it on to their friends, and they pass it on to their friends, and so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Right. I think that we are quickly running out of time, but before we do go, I think that it would be great to come back very briefly to Danny and Anna and Nicola, to ask you about what you think we can do and do better to improve this and to solve this problem. Starting with Danny, if we can.
Hi, yeah, wonderful, thank you. Yes, I think the kind of talk about culture change in education is really important. I think we often have a situation where people are living, working and socializing together, often, sometimes for the first time living away from home, coming from an environment where they haven't had any comprehensive sex education or any meaningful education about the complexities of consent. Consent isn't simple, it's messy, and it should be taught as such. And I think on the other hand, we also, when we're talking about education of students, we also need to be talking about education of staff and those of who are running these universities. I mean, I had a consent workshop at university and later found out that it was run by someone who had been accused of sexual assault as their punishment. So if those are the people that are teaching us about consent, is that consent workshop educating students? I'd let you answer that. So I think we need to think about, you know, who's making these decisions, how are we educating them, whose job is it to educate them about consent, because it's not true that it's just the students, it's also the staff making the decisions about these investigations, about these policies. And so for a real culture change, I think we need to start there and not necessarily just with the students.
Great. And I don't know if we have time to come back to Anna and Nicola, unfortunately, but sort of for my summary of the hour, I'd like to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us, and for especially to the students that we've heard from. And I think Phoebe has posted my email address in the chat in case you'd like to speak further. But in terms of where we've come to in this discussion, I think the main points for me are that we don't know well enough the scale of the problem, and until we know exactly what we're addressing, and until we have greater oversight over that, it's not going to be possible perhaps for institutions to really see that this is, I mean, I think it is something that they know that they have to deal with, but it isn't something that is documented enough, and there need to be like clear data and clear benchmarks for universities that are doing badly and universities that are doing well on this. And I think, as Gemma said, there needs to be acknowledgement that there is a problem from universities, because too often universities are not doing what they need to do because they're more frightened about the PR implications of having complaints come out in the media, or you know, having that data come out about how many complaints of sexual violence there were at that university, rather than seeing this as the problem is actually this is happening to our students, and we need to make sure that we are working proactively to make sure that we are changing our institution and our culture. As Danny said, it starts with the university itself. It starts with education in schools and within universities. So that's another huge portion of this here. In terms of the OFS statement of expectations, I think that what we've heard here is that it is an important step. It does move us forward, but we need to make sure that we have those regulatory teeth there. And it sounds like if universities aren't stepping up to the mark, that will happen. And you know, this is sort of a line in the sand to say, universities, your regulator is saying that you need to change. What are you going to do about it? So it's promising, but we need to make sure that those points are actually acted upon. So thank you all so much for this evening. There's a lot for us to take away and think about. And I hope you all have a good evening.